I thought reconnecting with my first crush after years would be a dream come true, but she turned it into my worst nightmare when she ambushed me with her boyfriend after hinting we'd be alone together. The notification sat on my phone for 3 days before I finally responded. After years of occasional birthday messages and holiday greetings, my first crush from high school had reached out about our prom anniversary. Something about the message felt different this time, more personal, like she actually wanted to talk, rather than just maintain the polite distance we'd kept for years. When we met up that night, it felt like no time had passed at all. We spent hours walking around our small town, talking about everything and nothing, laughing at old memories and creating new ones. The connection I'd felt for her back in high school came rushing back with a force that caught me completely off guard. I'd thought those feelings were long buried, just a teenage crush that had faded with time, but sitting across from her in that coffee shop, I realized they'd only been dormant. After that night, we started texting regularly. I found myself checking my phone constantly, waiting for her messages, crafting careful responses that were flirty but not too forward. She seemed receptive, matching my energy, sending me memes late at night and sharing random thoughts throughout her day. For the first time in my life, I felt like maybe I had a chance at something real with someone I genuinely cared about. When she called to invite me to an event a few weeks later, my heart practically jumped out of my chest. This was it, I thought. This was my moment to see if there could be something more between us. I spent an embarrassing amount of time picking out my outfit and rehearsing casual conversation topics in my head. Looking back now, I should have asked more questions. I should have clarified what this invitation really meant. The event itself was fine, but the real highlight was afterward. We ended up walking around for hours, just the two of us talking under the streetlights. She kept touching my arm when she laughed, standing close enough that I could smell her perfume, complimenting me in ways that made my cheeks burn. At one point during the introductions earlier in the evening, she'd mentioned someone named her boyfriend, but it had been so casual and brief that I'd barely registered it. Now, walking alone with her, feeling the electricity between us, that detail seemed impossible to reconcile with reality. Later that night, lying in bed, replaying every moment, every touch, every smile, I couldn't shake the confusion. She had a boyfriend, but she'd spent the entire evening acting like she was single and interested in me. Part of me wondered if I'd misheard, if maybe she'd said ex-boyfriend and I'd missed the prefix. The other part of me, the part with zero relationship experience and even less confidence, worried that I was reading way too much into friendly gestures. The text continued after that night, and I kept up the flirty banter, waiting for her to draw a line if I crossed it. That line never came. Instead, a few weeks later, I got a message that made my hands shake as I read it. She'd broken up with her boyfriend. She didn't elaborate much, didn't seem particularly sad about it, just stated it as a fact and moved the conversation forward. I didn't know what to say, so I offered some generic supportive response and tried not to let my hopes show too obviously through the screen. The conversation about watching a show at my place started innocently enough. We'd been talking about our favorite series, and she mentioned wanting to watch something I'd recommended. When I suggested she could come over to watch it, I expected her to deflect or suggest a group hangout instead. What I didn't expect was her response about making sure my bedroom was clean. My bedroom. Not my living room, not my apartment in general, my bedroom specifically. I read that message about 50 times, trying to convince myself I wasn't misinterpreting it. My friends, the few I trusted enough to tell about this situation, all had the same reaction. They knew what that meant, what she was implying. I was terrified and excited in equal measure. The day she was supposed to come over, I cleaned my entire place 3 times. I changed my sheets, lit a candle, then blew it out because that seemed too obvious, then lit it again because the room needed to smell nice. I checked my reflection in every mirror, changed my shirt twice, and practiced looking casual while sitting on my couch. When the doorbell rang, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure she'd be able to hear it. From the moment she walked in, something felt off. I was nervous, obviously, but she seemed nervous too, which I hadn't expected. We settled in to watch the show, sitting on opposite ends of the couch with this massive, awkward space between us. Every time I thought about moving closer, my brain would freeze and flood me with images of all the ways it could go wrong. What if I moved too fast? What if she wasn't actually interested and I'd misread everything? What if I embarrassed myself so badly she never wanted to see me again? At one point, I worked up the courage to reach for her hand. My palm was sweating, my heart was racing, and as our fingers touched, I could feel how tense she was too. Instead of relaxing into it, we both seemed to tense up more. She pulled away after a few seconds, and I immediately retreated back to my end of the couch, convinced I'd ruined everything. She tried to reinitiate contact later, shifting closer to me, but I was so deep in my own head by then that I barely noticed until the moment had passed. I watched her fidget with her hair, saw the way she kept glancing at me, then looking away, noticed how she checked her phone more frequently as the night went on. She was regretting coming here, I was sure of it. She'd made a move by suggesting my bedroom, and I'd completely failed to follow through. The confident, flirty version of me that existed over text had evaporated the moment real stakes were involved, replaced by this anxious, frozen version who couldn't even hold her hand properly. When she left that night, we both knew something had gone terribly wrong. The hug goodbye was brief and awkward, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. I closed the door behind her and immediately wanted to punch a wall. My first real chance at something with someone I cared about, and I'd frozen like a complete amateur. That night I barely slept, replaying every moment and hating myself for every failure. The next few days were a blur of desperate attempts to fix what I'd broken. I texted her constantly, trying to explain, trying to apologize, trying to somehow convey that my nervousness didn't mean I wasn't interested. Every message I sent made things worse. I could feel it in her delayed responses, in the shortening of her replies, in the way the conversation that used to flow so naturally now felt like pulling teeth. When I finally managed to catch her in person for a few minutes, I was ready to pour my heart out. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, how I'd explain my feelings and ask for another chance. But before I could get any of that out, she dropped the bomb. She was back with her boyfriend. She said it so casually, like it was no big deal, like it was inevitable. She'd had a weak heart, she said, couldn't handle being alone. I stood there, speechless, as her phone rang for the third time in our 20-minute conversation, her boyfriend calling to check where she was. I managed to stammer out something about how nervous I'd been, how sorry I was for freezing up. She tried to take some of the blame, said she was nervous too, said it wasn't my fault, all the things people say when they're trying to let someone down easy. I wanted to tell her how I really felt, wanted to lay it all out there, but what was the point? She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. Watching her get into her boyfriend's car, seeing the way he glared at me through the window, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't healthy. This whole situation, from the moment she'd first reached out, had been a mess of mixed signals and bad timing. I needed space, needed to clear my head and figure out how to move on from feelings that had never really had a chance to become anything real. For 2 weeks, I kept my distance. She'd send me memes or random messages, and I'd respond with one word, just enough to not be completely rude, but not enough to encourage real conversation. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just needed to protect myself. Every time my phone buzzed with her name, my heart would jump and my stomach would sink simultaneously. Then came the message thanking me for encouraging her to apply for something she'd been afraid to try. She'd gotten in, whatever it was, and wanted to celebrate by hanging out. Against every instinct telling me to decline, I found myself agreeing. Maybe it was because she seemed genuinely happy, and I didn't want to be the one to dim that. Maybe it was because despite everything, I still wanted to see her. Maybe I'm just an idiot. The plan sounded perfect. Just the two of us playing video games, eating dessert she'd make. It sounded casual and low pressure, exactly what we needed after the disaster of our first attempt. I even checked with my best friend, laid out the whole situation for him, and he agreed it sounded like she was giving me a second chance. The universe was offering me a do-over, and this time I was determined not to freeze up. When she canceled the day we were supposed to hang out, I almost took it as a sign to bail on the whole thing. She'd canceled on me before, and I was tired of feeling like I was always the one putting in more effort, caring more, hoping more. But she immediately offered to reschedule for 2 days later, and stupidly I agreed. I should have listened to my gut. I should have made up an excuse and let the whole thing fade away. But I didn't. The day arrived, and she picked me up. She was being mysterious about where we were going, which should have been my first warning sign. When I hugged her hello, I was so nervous and excited that I lifted her off the ground and spun her around. She laughed, and for a moment everything felt right. We talked as she drove, the conversation flowing easily like it used to, and I let myself believe that maybe things were finally going to work out. We pulled up to a house I didn't recognize in a part of town I rarely visited. She parked, and we walked through the yard gate together, together, still chatting about nothing important. I was following her to the door, trying to figure out whose place this was, when she reached for the door handle and stopped. What she said next felt like a physical blow. Her boyfriend was inside. The words didn't compute at first. I actually laughed, thinking it must be a joke, some weird attempt at humor I wasn't getting. But she just looked at me, waiting for my reaction, and I realized she was completely serious. Her boyfriend, the one she'd gotten back together with, the one I'd watched pick her up after our last conversation, was inside this house, and she'd brought me here to hang out with both of them. I should have turned around right then. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to leave, to preserve whatever dignity I had left, but I was so shocked, so blindsided, that I just stood there like an idiot. And then, somehow, I heard myself say, "Okay." I watched my own hand reach out and open that door. I followed her inside to meet the boyfriend, smiling and acting normal when nothing about this situation was normal. The next few hours were torture. We sat in their living room playing video games while he lounged nearby, occasionally making snide comments or crude jokes that made my skin crawl. At one point, he actually passed gas loudly and laughed about it, and I had to sit there and pretend I wasn't completely humiliated. She acted like everything was fine, like this was a totally normal hangout, like she hadn't specifically made plans that sounded like they'd be just the two of us. I kept thinking about leaving, but then what? Make a scene? Demand an explanation? I had no idea how to handle this situation. Part of me wondered if I'd misunderstood her intentions from the start, if all those signals I'd read as romantic interest were just friendliness and I'd built up a fantasy in my head. But no, I knew what she'd implied. I knew what making sure my bedroom was clean meant. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. When I finally left, I walked to the gate with her, and we actually discussed when we could hang out next. I gave her a date, smiled, acted like I'd had a great time. The mask didn't slip until I was around the corner, out of sight. Then I had to stop and lean against a wall because my hands were shaking so badly. The humiliation, the anger, the confusion, all of it crashed over me at once. I'd been used somehow, though I still wasn't entirely sure how or why. When her first message came through a few days later, I stared at it for an hour without opening it. Every part of me wanted to respond, wanted to unleash everything I was feeling, wanted to demand an explanation for what she'd done. But my friend talked me down, reminded me that engaging would only make things worse. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could, he told me, so I let the message sit unread. The guilt started immediately. I'd been on the receiving end of ghosting before, knew how awful it felt to be left without explanation, without closure, just empty silence where a person used to be. I'd promised myself I'd never do that to someone else, that I'd always have the courage to communicate even when it was uncomfortable. Yet here I was, doing exactly what I'd sworn I'd never do. But what was I supposed to say? That she'd humiliated me? That she'd led me on? That I'd developed real feelings and she'd treated me like a prop in whatever game she was playing with her boyfriend? Any message I tried to craft sounded either pathetic or angry, and I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of either. So the silence stretched on, day after day, and I tried to convince myself I was getting over it. A week later, another message. I didn't even look at the notification this time, just swiped it away and tried to focus on my studies. But the anger had started to build. How could she be so casual? How could she send me random messages like nothing had happened, like she hadn't completely disrespected me? The nerve of it actually helped in a way. It made the silence easier to maintain when I could fuel it with righteous indignation instead of guilt. Time passed and I started to believe I was healing. The obsessive thoughts came less frequently. I could go hours without checking my phone to see if she'd messaged again. My sleep improved. I threw myself into exam preparation, grateful for the distraction. I thought I'd moved on, that I'd successfully put this whole mess behind me without ever having to confront it directly. I don't believe in fate or destiny or any of that, but the day I saw her at the bus station, I questioned everything. Of all the days, of all the times, of all the possible transportation options in our region, we ended up needing the same bus to the same city. When I spotted her approaching, my entire body went rigid. I immediately looked down at my phone, praying she hadn't seen me yet, praying she'd somehow not notice me standing there. I heard her buy her ticket, heard her voice for the first time in over a month, and had to resist the urge to look up. Then I heard footsteps behind me and knew she'd seen me. When I finally glanced back, she had her hoodie pulled up, face partially hidden, determinedly not looking in my direction. We were both playing the same game of pretend, both acting like we hadn't noticed each other when we clearly had. The bus was packed, every single seat taken except for one row, and of course, she was sitting in the row right right behind it. As I walked down the aisle and spotted her, she immediately turned to face the window, hoodie still up, giving me her back. The only available seat was directly in front of her. I'd have to sit there for 2 hours feeling her presence behind me, both of us pretending the other didn't exist. I couldn't do it. I spotted a guy a couple rows up with his bag on the seat next to him and asked if I could sit there instead. He looked confused but moved his stuff, and I squeezed in next to him, probably looking completely insane. 2 hours on a crowded bus sitting next to a stranger rather than taking the empty seat that was rightfully mine. But the alternative was unbearable. The entire ride, I was hyper-aware of her behind me. I kept thinking I should turn around, should say something, should finally break this stupid silence and just talk to her like an adult. I imagined different versions of the conversation, different ways I could express how she'd made me feel without sounding pathetic or angry. But I couldn't make myself do it. Not here, not in public, not when we'd have to sit together for another hour and a half afterward if it went badly. When we finally arrived and I could escape the bus, I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed in myself. Another chance to address this had passed, and I'd chickened out again. The silence that had felt righteous and justified a month ago now felt cowardly. I'd taken the easy way out, and it was becoming clear that the easy way was also the way that was slowly eating me alive. That night, I couldn't sleep again. All the progress I thought I'd made evaporated in the span of that 2-hour bus ride. I kept thinking about how she'd looked when our eyes met for that brief second. The mix of emotions I'd seen flash across her face before she'd turned away. Had that been guilt, regret, anger, relief? I had no idea, and not knowing was somehow worse than knowing for certain that she didn't care. The guilt about ghosting her came roaring back with a vengeance. My brain kept trying to justify it, reminding me of how she'd treated me, how she'd led me on and then humiliated me. But my heart kept countering that 2 wrongs don't make a right, that I'd become exactly the kind of person I'd always criticized. I'd let my hurt feelings turn me into someone who inflicted hurt on others, and I hated myself for it. Part of me wanted to message her right then, to finally explain why I'd gone silent, to tell her that what she'd done had crossed a line for me. Seeing each other on that bus felt like a sign, like the universe giving me permission to break my silence, since we'd technically seen each other even if we hadn't spoken. But every draft I wrote sounded wrong. Too apologetic, too angry, too desperate, too cold. Nothing captured the complicated mess of emotions I was feeling. My friends had already given their opinions. They said I was right to cut her off, that she'd used me and I owed her nothing. They said engaging again would just open old wounds and accomplish nothing. They spoke from experience, from their multiple relationships and breakups and all the messy situations they'd navigated over the years. But none of them seemed to understand that this was different for me. This was supposed to be my first real experience with romance, and instead it had become this confusing, painful situation that I had no idea how to resolve. The unread message sat in my phone like a weight. I still hadn't looked at what she'd sent weeks ago. Part of me desperately wanted to know what it said, wanted any insight into what she was thinking or feeling. But I was terrified too. What if it was an apology? What if it was an explanation? What if it made me forgive her when I was still so angry? What if it made everything more complicated than it already was? Days passed and I remained stuck, unable to move forward or backward. I couldn't focus on my books, couldn't retain information from my exams, couldn't stop my mind from cycling through the same thoughts over and over. I'd somehow managed to do what I thought was impossible and become more obsessed with her after ghosting her than I'd been when we were actually talking. Lying in bed one night, unable to sleep yet again, I forced myself to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't upset about what happened because she'd led me on or humiliated me or crossed my boundaries, though all of those things were true. I was upset because I'd genuinely developed feelings for her. Real feelings that went beyond just attraction or nostalgia for my first crush. And those feelings hadn't just disappeared because she'd treated me poorly. Nothing had actually happened between us. No kiss, no intimate moment, no official date, nothing that would typically mark the beginning of something romantic. Yet somehow I was more attached to her than made any logical sense. I was mourning a relationship that never existed, grieving potential rather than reality. The version of her I couldn't stop thinking about wasn't even real. It was an idealized image I'd constructed based on a few good conversations and a lot of wishful thinking. The version of her that invited me over with her boyfriend, that was the real her. Or at least, that was who she was capable of being. Even if we somehow started talking again, Even if she apologized and explained everything, it wouldn't erase what she'd done. The trust was broken, the image shattered. Things would never go back to how they were, either the comfortable distance of our past or the exciting possibility of our brief reconnection. What I wanted, I realized, was impossible. I wanted to go back to before the prom anniversary, when she was just a person I used to know that I thought about occasionally with mild fondness. I wanted to erase the past few months entirely, to unknow everything I now knew about who she was and who I became around her. I wanted to run into her in our small town and feel nothing more than the pleasant awkwardness of greeting an old acquaintance. But that wasn't an option. We lived in the same small place, crossed paths in the same spaces, existed in the same small world. Eventually, we'd run into each other again, maybe at the grocery store or a local event, or another ridiculous coincidence like that bus. We couldn't avoid each other forever, and the thought of crossing the street every time I spotted her made me feel pathetic and small. The question wasn't whether I should message her. The question was whether I could live with myself if I didn't. Could I really maintain this silence, knowing how much I hated it when people did it to me? Could I really deprive her of an explanation, of closure, of the basic respect of being told directly that I needed space from her? The answer, I was starting to realize, was no. No matter how justified my anger, no matter how much she'd hurt me, I couldn't be that person. I opened my messages and finally looked at what she'd sent. It was nothing earth-shattering, just a funny video she thought I'd like. Casual, normal, the kind of thing she used to send all the time. Somehow, that made it worse. After everything that had happened, she could still send me random memes like none of it mattered. Like I didn't matter. I started typing and deleting messages for over an hour. Every version felt wrong. Finally, I wrote something simple and honest. I told her that what happened at her boyfriend's place had really hurt me, that I felt ambushed and disrespected, and that I needed space to deal with my feelings about the whole situation. I told her I was sorry for going silent without explanation, because I knew how that felt. I told her I hoped she was doing well, but that I needed to move on from whatever this was between us. My finger hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity. Once I sent this, there was no taking it back. This would be the official end of whatever potential had existed between us. But keeping it unsent, continuing this silence, that wasn't moving forward either. It was just staying frozen in this painful, in-between space. I hit send before I could overthink it anymore. The message showed as delivered, then read a few minutes later. I waited for a response, my heart pounding, but none came. Maybe she was processing. Maybe she was hurt. Maybe she didn't care enough to respond. I'd probably never know, and I had to be okay with that. The relief I expected didn't come immediately. Instead, I just felt tired, exhausted from weeks of obsessing, of guilt, of anger, of confusion. But underneath the tiredness was something else, something small but real. It was the tiniest sense of peace from finally doing something instead of remaining paralyzed by indecision. I don't know if I made the right choice. My friends will probably say I shouldn't have engaged at all, that I gave her more than she deserved. Part of me agrees with them, but I did it for me, not for her. I did it so I could live with myself, so I could look back on this whole mess and know that I at least tried to handle it with integrity, even if I failed at everything else. The feelings are still there. I'm not naive enough to think one message will make them disappear. I'll probably think about her for a while yet, wonder what could have been if circumstances were different, if we'd both been different people. But maybe now I can start to actually move forward instead of just pretending to. She was my first real crush, and in a weird way, this whole disaster was my first real heartbreak. Not because anything actually happened between us, but because I finally let myself hope for something real, only to have it fall apart. That loss of hope, of possibility. Maybe that's what heartbreak really is, the death of potential. Our small town suddenly feels even smaller, knowing I'll inevitably see her again. But next time, maybe I'll be ready. Maybe I'll have processed enough to just nod politely and keep walking. Maybe she'll do the same. Maybe we'll eventually find our way back to that comfortable distance we had before, where we're not friends but not hostile strangers either. Just two people who used to know each other once, who briefly tried to know each other again, and who learned that some things are better left in the past. For now, I'm trying to focus on myself, on my studies that I've been neglecting, on my friends who've been patient with my obsessing, on figuring out who I am outside of these feelings I've been drowning in. This was supposed to be my first experience with romance, and instead it became a masterclass in complicated emotions and poor communication. But maybe that's valuable too. Maybe now I'll recognize red flags earlier, establish boundaries better, and have the courage to walk away sooner when something isn't right. I still don't have all the answers. I don't know why she did what she did. Don't know if she ever actually had feelings for me, or if I was just a convenient distraction from her relationship problems. I don't know if she feels any guilt about how things ended, or if she's already moved on completely, and I'm learning to be okay with not knowing. Some questions don't have satisfying answers, and some endings don't come with closure tied up in a neat bow. What I do know is that I survived this. It felt impossible some days, like the weight of all these emotions would crush me completely. But I woke up every morning, got through every day, and slowly the pain became less sharp. It's still there, but it's becoming something I carry rather than something that carries me. And maybe that's what growing up is, learning to carry your pain instead of letting it carry you.